these anti-nutrients that come up. I feel like there's been a lot of talk over the last few years in particular with, the plants are trying to kill you, and there's these lectins and oxalates and things within beans and plants that are causes of leaky gut. What do you make of all of that noise?
Yeah, this is something I've discussed with people like Dr. Anthony Chafee and Paul Saladino.
Yeah.
And I have an open invite to both of them. I would love to
see that debate.
I would love to have a conversation with both of them on any platform, really. But I think there's generally a lot of fear-mongering. And I see a lot of what people like Paul and Anthony put out there. I see a lot of people just regurgitating that who maybe aren't really looking at the evidence. I mean, broadly, let's just start very high level. If these plants are trying to kill us, they're not doing a great job, because in the studies that we look at, when people are eating more of them, they do better. The other thing is it's hard to blame the average person's poor health. Let's say, in the United States, it's hard to blame the incidence of obesity and type 2 diabetes, these chronic conditions, on certain plant compounds when 95% of the population are not eating the recommended fruits and vegetables and these foods, right? So I think it's difficult to blame something that's not in our diet for wreaking havoc. Is important for us to look at. One of the papers that gets cited, and Anthony Chafee cites this a lot, is a paper by Bruce Ames, and it's an old paper. The paper was essentially, it was looking at what compounds, sort of defense chemicals, are found naturally in plants, and how toxic are they really? And they identified there are a lot of compounds in plants that plants use as defense chemicals to ward off pathogens and insects and bugs and these sorts of things, right? That causes those bugs not to come back. It's different to humans. They're not doing that to us. They're not killing us, so we don't go back, right? We can still go back. And the whole purpose of this paper, and they make it explicit in the paper, but this is always overlooked and not shared when cited, is all they were doing was comparing the relative toxicity of these natural compounds with synthetic pesticides, right? And the purpose of the paper was not to suggest that we should avoid fruits and vegetables. It was literally, he was putting it out there to say maybe the synthetic pesticides are not that bad, because even the natural pesticides that are in the fruits and vegetables are not toxic to humans. That was the position of that paper, and people can look that up. It's only 2 or 3 pages long, and you can read all of that in the summary. I actually want to interview him at some stage. And then more recently, Stephen Gundry has really brought a lot of attention to lectins, and particularly phytohemagglutinin, which is one type of lectin. And there's actually 500 lectins. I'm not sure people appreciate that. Lectins are proteins. The evidence that Gundry will cite is not human data looking at feeding lectin-containing foods to people that have been properly prepared and looking at inflammation or gut function. Those are non-existent. The evidence that he'll cite is animal studies or even cell culture studies where you isolate lectins out of a food and you expose that cell or those animals to an incredibly high load of lectins and look at what happens. But all of those studies, even if you were to say those are meaningful, which I don't think they are, because the way lectins behave in a food matrix is going to be different to how they behave isolated. But even if you did, we would never, ever, ever get anywhere close to that level of exposure through food on a milligram per kilogram of body weight basis. The only human evidence that he cites, which I would agree with, there are takeaways from this evidence, is looking at the consumption of raw or improperly prepared beans and rice grains. And there are a few different studies out there showing that if you consume legumes that haven't been properly prepared, that they can be toxic. They contain a high amount of these lectins.
Well, who's eating raw beans and rice? I know, there's many ways to prepare them. I know if you like cook them in a pressure cooker, right, then it has less of what he would say is lectins that would be deleterious.
Yeah, I think he even promotes that, but I don't think that you need to even do that. Just standard soaking and boiling, which would already be done if you buy canned beans.
Right.
You're boiling at 100 degrees or higher, and it's going to be for well over 15, 20 minutes. That gets rid of pretty much all lectins, like 93 to 95% of lectins. And because if you chew on a legume, it should be very soft and it kind of melts in the back part of your mouth, right? Yeah. If you're biting into a legume that hasn't been cooked, Same with a grain. So these studies that he points to, these are where I think a couple of them are like cafeterias, and they undercooked the legumes and served them to people. And there was case studies where they had symptoms of abdominal, gastrointestinal upset. So that's kind of the lectin story. And we actually have really good data looking at inflammation. People that are consuming a low amount of lectin-containing foods and a high amount, and people that contain more lectin-containing foods, more legumes, tend to have lower inflammation. So, I think it's hard for us to kind of demonize lectins. I would just say if you're properly preparing your food, then I don't think it's something for people to worry about. There may be some exceptions of people with severe gastrointestinal problems, but for the majority of people, I think it's a kind of fear-mongering that we don't need to pay attention to.
Maybe we would have him on at some point to dive deeper into. I'm just curious. He seems very convinced that it's very, very bad for the system.
Yeah. Well, come back to the idea that absolute sell.
Yeah.
He came out and said, we've missed it. We've missed everything. We've been looking at the wrong thing. It's lectins. And, that creates a lot of attention and a lot of hype, sold a lot of books. But the data doesn't support his position on that. Why do we see the longest living populations in the world consume diets that are rich in legumes?
We'll leave it there. Because there are a few other ones that I do want to dive into. So when people speak to phytoestrogens and, switching from animal protein to, soy is a big one, the soy boy, people feel like, by eating these compounds that you're going to actually increase estrogen in your system. What are people hanging their hat on when they talk to that? And is it valid at all?
It's gained a lot of traction over the years. What are people hanging their hat on? I think if you pressed most people, it's just a view that they hold. I don't think they've challenged it. And that happens a lot in nutrition. But it may stem from, there's one or two very well-known case studies where, one in particular where a young adult male presented to his physician with gynecomastia. So he had enlarged breast tissue. And as part of taking that patient's history, he discovered that this guy was drinking 12 serves of soy milk a day. And upon ceasing that, the gynecomastia went away or reduced significantly. And that got sort of written up. Again, that's not a controlled trial, but think about the dose anyway. Red flag. Consuming 12 cups of soy milk a day. I think if you consume 12 cups of cow's milk a day, you may have some problems too. Sure. Anything in overdose can be a problem. But we have really strong clinical evidence looking at like actual controlled studies where you feed people soy foods or isoflavones, which are the concentrated phytoestrogens that you mentioned, and measure estrogen, measure testosterone free in total. Look at just how do these foods or these compounds affect hormones. And there's a 2020 meta-analysis of 41 clinical control trials. They lasted anywhere from 2 weeks up to a year long. which is enough time to see if these foods are affecting hormones. And there was no significant effect of these either isolated compounds or foods on estrogen levels or testosterone. This was in males, this study. And what was the exposure amount? It was equivalent across the board to about 3 serves of soy a day. That's in line with traditional soy consumption. So my takeaway from this is, you don't need to overdo it. I wouldn't recommend you overdo it with any sort of single food or food group, but up to 3 serves seems completely safe, and it's a high quality protein, contains unsaturated fats in edamame, soybeans, and tofu. So I think, the evidence strongly suggests it's safe. And if someone, was going to make the claim that it increases estrogen levels, I would like to read the study that supports that.